The frontier is a harsh, unforgiving mistress that takes far more than she ever gives. In the brutal, blinding winter of 1887, a desperate mountain man appeared on the doorstep of a grieving widow, clutching a dying infant in his frostbitten hands. He came begging for a simple cup of cow's milk to save his newborn's life. What happened next on that isolated Colorado homestead became a legend whispered in the mining camps and saloons for decades. She didn't have any cow's milk, but she saved the child anyway, in the most intimate way a mother could. But this rugged stranger was harboring a dark, deadly secret, and a ruthless posse was already riding hard on his trail, bringing blood and fire to her door. The blizzard that hit the high country of Colorado in late November of 1887 was one the locals would later call the White Death. It buried the small mining settlement of Pine Ridge under 4 feet of snow in 2 days, cutting off the remote homesteads scattered along the valley. At the very edge of the timberline sat the lonely cabin of Abigail Preston. Abigail was a woman entirely consumed by the heavy, suffocating weight of grief. Just 3 months prior, her husband, a hard-working carpenter named David, had been taken by a sudden, violent fever. Left heavily pregnant and alone to manage their meager homestead, Abigail had fought with every ounce of her strength to keep the fire burning and the wolves at bay. But the frontier was cruel. 3 days before the storm broke, Abigail had gone into premature labor. With only old Mrs. Gable from the neighboring farm to assist her, Abigail had delivered a stillborn daughter. Now, trapped by the howling wind and walls of snow, Abigail sat in a rocking chair by the hearth, her body aching with a profound, hollow emptiness. Nature, in its bitter irony, ignored her tragedy. Her milk had come in, leaving her physically pained, a constant, agonizing reminder of the child she would never hold. The wind battered the wooden shingles, sounding like the shrieks of lost souls. It was near midnight when she heard it. A heavy, rhythmic thudding against the heavy oak of her front door. At first, Abigail thought it was the wind throwing a loose branch against the porch, but the sound came again urgent, desperate, unmistakable pounding. She hesitated, reaching for the heavy iron fireplace poker. The nearest neighbor was a mile away. No sane person was out in a storm that could freeze a man solid in minutes. The pounding stopped, replaced by a deep, ragged voice shouting over the gale. "Help! Dear God! Please! Open the door!" Abigail unlatched the heavy iron deadbolt and pulled the door inward. The wind violently whipped the door out of her grip, sending a spray of icy white powder across the floorboards. Standing in the threshold was a terrifying sight. He was a giant of a man, clad in heavily patched buffalo skins and a wide-brimmed leather hat caked in ice. His beard was wild, frozen into sharp icicles, and his broad shoulders heaved with exhaustion. He looked like a wild beast driven down from the treacherous peaks of the Rockies. Before Abigail could raise her weapon, the man fell to his knees on her porch. He didn't look up at her, he just looked down at a bundle of wool and furs clutched tightly to his chest. "Please," the man rasped, his voice cracking with dry frozen terror. "My horse went down 2 miles back. I saw your chimney smoke. Please, I need milk." Abigail stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Milk? Mister, I don't." The man pulled back a flap of the frozen wool. Inside, perfectly insulated but frighteningly still, was an infant. The baby's face was pale, almost blue around the tiny lips, and its eyes were shut. It let out a weak, raspy mewl that didn't even have the strength of a proper cry. "He's starving," the giant man sobbed, a sound so broken and incongruous with his massive, rugged frame that it stripped away all of Abigail's fear. His mother. She didn't make it. "I've been feeding him sugar water, but it ain't enough. He's failing. I beg of you, ma'am, if you have a cow, a goat, anything, I'll pay you in gold. I'll chop your wood for a year. Just give me a cup of milk for my boy." Abigail stared at the dying infant. Her breath caught in her throat. Her own body throbbed with a heavy ache. The cow out back in the barn was dry, completely useless. She had no livestock milk to give this desperate father. But she looked at the baby's sunken cheeks, and a fierce, primal instinct overrode all of her Victorian sensibilities and frontier caution. "Bring him inside," Abigail commanded, her voice suddenly steady and authoritative. "Now, before the draft kills him." The mountain man stumbled into the cabin, bringing the scent of pine needles, wet fur, and desperation with him. Abigail threw her weight against the door, fighting the wind to latch it shut. She pointed to the thick, braided rug in front of the roaring hearth. "Put him there. Get those wet furs off him, gently." The man fumbled with his thick, frostbitten fingers, peeling away the heavy animal skins to reveal a tiny, frail boy wrapped in a flannel shirt. "I'm Josiah," the man said, his eyes wild with panic. "Josiah Cole. Please, ma'am, the milk." "I don't have a milking cow, Mr. Cole," Abigail said softly, dropping to her knees beside the child. Josiah's face crumpled in absolute despair. A raw, guttural cry of defeat tore from his throat, and he buried his face in his massive hands. "Then he's gone. Oh God, I've killed him. I carried him through hell, and I killed him." "Turn around, Josiah," Abigail said. Her voice was quiet, but it held a steel that made the giant man pause and look up at her through his tears. "What?" "I said turn around, face the door, and do not look back until I tell you to," Abigail instructed, her cheeks flushing hot despite the chill in the room. She began to unbutton the high collar of her mourning dress. Comprehension dawned slowly in Josiah's exhausted eyes, followed by a look of profound, staggering gratitude. He swallowed hard, nodded once, and immediately turned his back, fixing his gaze on the frosted window pane. Abigail carefully lifted the fragile infant into her arms. The baby weighed almost nothing, a mere wisp of a life fading into the cold. She settled into the rocking chair, her heart breaking all over again at the familiar, agonizing weight of a newborn in her arms. She guided the baby, praying to whatever God was listening over the roaring wind. At first, the child was too weak. He didn't react. Panic fluttered in Abigail's chest. "Come on, little one," she whispered, tears spilling over her lashes and dropping onto the baby's pale forehead. "Come on. You have to fight." She coaxed him gently, and then a miracle. A tiny shudder ran through the infant's body, and he latched on. In the quiet of the cabin, the only sounds were the violent storm outside, the crackle of the fire, and the rhythmic, life-saving swallows of the child. A sob of sheer relief escaped Abigail's lips. The intense physical pain of her engorgement began to ease, replaced by a profound, overwhelming wave of maternal warmth. She was feeding a stranger's child, but in that quiet, desperate hour, he became hers to protect. Josiah stood by the door, completely still, listening to the soft sounds of his son being pulled back from the brink of death. "Thank you," he whispered to the wooden door, his voice thick with emotion. "You are an angel sent by the Almighty himself." For 4 days and 4 nights, the blizzard raged, effectively sealing Abigail, Josiah, and the baby whom Josiah had named Samuel inside the small cabin. In those close quarters, a strange, quiet domesticity formed out of pure necessity. By the second day, little Samuel was a different child. The blue tint had left his skin, replaced by a healthy, rosy flush. He had a strong, demanding cry when he woke hungry, a sound that brought a small, genuine smile to Abigail's lips for the first time in months. She fell into a natural rhythm of motherhood, waking in the night to nurse him, bathing him in a tin basin by the fire, and rocking him to sleep while humming old lullabies. Josiah proved to be a quiet, intensely observant man. Once he had thawed out and recovered his strength, he took over all the heavy labor. He chopped the firewood stacked on the back porch with terrifying, rhythmic power. He fixed a broken hinge on the pantry door, and he cooked hearty meals using the salted pork and dried beans from Abigail's cellar. Despite his imposing, rugged exterior, the thick beard, the scars that crossed his forearms, the heavy Colt revolver he kept meticulously oiled and strapped to his hip even inside the house, Josiah treated Abigail with a reverence that bordered on worship. He never crossed the invisible boundaries she set. When she nursed Samuel, Josiah always found a reason to check the perimeter, clean his rifle, or simply sit with his back to her, staring into the flames. One evening, after the baby had been fed and was sleeping soundly in a makeshift cradle fashioned from a wooden crate, Abigail and Josiah sat opposite each other by the hearth. The wind had finally begun to die down, the howling replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. "You never told me how you ended up on the mountain with a newborn in the dead of winter, Josiah," Abigail said softly, mending a tear in one of her late husband's shirts that she intended to let Josiah borrow. Josiah tensed, his large hands resting on his knees, balled into fists before slowly relaxing. He stared into the fire, the orange light casting deep shadows over his rugged features. My wife, Sarah. She was a delicate thing, city girl from back east. She wasn't built for the high country, but she loved me enough to follow me here. We had a cabin up near the ridge. When her time came, it went bad. Really bad. She bled out before I could even get down the mountain for Doc Miller. Abigail's heart ached with empathy. I am so incredibly sorry. I know the pain of an empty nursery. Josiah looked at her, his eyes softening. I know. Mrs. Gable, the widow down the valley. I stopped at her place first before the storm hit full force. She pointed me to your chimney, told me you had just lost your little girl. She said it was a long shot, but you might be able to save him. Abigail paused her sewing. That made sense, but something in Josiah's demeanor felt carefully constructed. He was a man holding back a tide. Why were you fleeing, Josiah? She asked, her voice calm but probing. You didn't just come down the mountain to find milk. You rode your horse to death in a blizzard. You keep checking the windows. You sleep with your hand on your iron. A man grieving his wife doesn't act like he's being hunted. Josiah's gaze snapped to hers. For a moment, the quiet, gentle giant was gone, replaced by a man who looked capable of incredible violence. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. There are bad men in this world, Abigail, he said finally, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Men who see a child not as a blessing, but as an obstacle to money and power. I brought Samuel down the mountain because if I stayed, they would have killed him. And they would have killed me for trying to stop them. He didn't elaborate, and Abigail didn't push. She looked over at the sleeping infant. She had fed this child from her own body. She had breathed life back into his frozen lungs. Whatever trouble Josiah Cole had dragged to her doorstep, she was already a part of it. She realized with a sudden, startling clarity that she was willing to die before she let anyone harm little Samuel. The tension in the cabin shifted over the next 2 days. As the snow slowly began to settle and the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, a quiet, unspoken bond forged between the widow and the mountain man. They operated like a team. They shared weary smiles over Samuel's coups. Once, when Abigail accidentally dropped a hot cast-iron skillet, Josiah was across the room in a flash, his large hands gently inspecting her burned fingers. The heat radiating from his chest, the smell of wood smoke on his skin, and the intense concern in his eyes made Abigail's breath catch. She pulled her hand away quickly, blushing, but she felt his gaze linger on her for a long time afterward. But the thaw outside brought more than just sunlight. It brought the clearing of the mountain passes. And with the cleared passes came the predators. It was high noon on the 5th day. The snow was glaringly bright, melting fast enough to create small rivers of slush running past the cabin. Abigail was sitting on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, nursing Samuel beneath its cover. Josiah was out back by the barn, digging a path to check on the livestock. The sharp crunch of hooves on crusty snow shattered the peaceful afternoon. Abigail looked up and felt the blood drain from her face. Riding up the long, winding path to her homestead were 6 men. They were heavily armed, wearing thick dusters and grim expressions. At their head rode a man on a massive black stallion. He wore a silver star pinned to his chest. Sheriff Wyatt Boone. Boone was a notorious figure in the territory. He was less a lawman and more a licensed enforcer for the wealthy cattle barons and mining tycoons in the region. He had cold, dead eyes and a reputation for shooting first and never bothering to ask questions later. Abigail quickly adjusted her dress, pulling Samuel tight against her chest, wrapping him securely in the heavy wool blanket to obscure him. She stood up, her spine rigid, as the men formed a semicircle around her front porch. Afternoon, Mrs. Preston, Boone drawled, touching the brim of his hat with a leather-gloved hand. His eyes swept over the property, calculating, searching. Mighty bad storm we just had. Glad to see you weathered it. Sheriff Boone, Abigail said, keeping her voice steady. What brings a posse all the way out to my homestead? You gentlemen are a long way from the warm saloons of Pine Ridge." Boone chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "We're hunting a fugitive, ma'am, a very dangerous man. Goes by the name of Josiah Cole." Abigail felt a cold spike of adrenaline pierce her heart. She kept her face blank. "Josiah Cole? Can't say the name means anything to me." Boone leaned forward over his saddle horn. "Well, he's a big fella. Looks like he crawled out of a bear cave. He's wanted for the brutal murder of his wife, Sarah. And worse, he kidnapped her newborn baby. We found the poor woman's body at their cabin up on the ridge before the storm hit. Looked like he beat her to death, stole the child, and rode off." Abigail's stomach violently revolted. Murdered his wife? Her mind raced back to Josiah's grief, his tears, his desperation. It didn't fit. The man who had sobbed over a dying infant, the man who had so gently checked her burned hand, could not be a wife killer. It was a lie. It had to be. "Like I said, Sheriff," Abigail replied, her tone icy, "I haven't seen anyone. As you can see, I've been snowed in for days. No one has come up this road." Boone's eyes narrowed, dropping down to the bundle in Abigail's arms. "Is that so? I heard tell from Doc Miller you lost your baby girl a few months back. Tragic, truly. So, what exactly are you holding there, Mrs. Preston?" Before Abigail could form a lie, a sudden, sharp, whistling sound echoed from the back of the cabin. It was a mountain jay's call. Josiah's signal. Boone's head snapped toward the sound. "He's here! Round the back, boys! Flush the bastard out!" The posse spurred their horses, shouting and drawing their rifles. Pandemonium erupted. Abigail spun around and rushed through the front door, slamming it shut behind her. "Josiah!" she screamed. The back door of the cabin burst open. Josiah stood there, a Winchester rifle gripped in his hands, a wild, desperate look in his eyes. He looked at Abigail, then down at Samuel in her arms. In that split second, a silent, agonizing conversation passed between them. He couldn't fight 6 armed men in a wooden cabin without risking Abigail and the baby getting caught in the crossfire, and he couldn't run with an infant. They would track him down and kill them both in the snow. "Josiah, they're coming," Abigail cried. "Boone says you murdered your wife." "Boone is a liar, Abigail. He's Sarah's brother. He wants the boy dead to steal her inheritance," Josiah shouted, confirming her deepest instincts. He rushed forward, bridging the gap between them. He didn't take the baby. Instead, he placed a large, calloused hand on Abigail's cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she didn't know she had shed. "Hide him. Protect him," Josiah whispered, his voice cracking. "I will come back for you both. I swear it on my life." Without another word, Josiah turned and dove out the side window of the cabin, the glass shattering outward into the snow just as the front door was kicked off its hinges by Boone's men. "There he goes! Into the tree line!" one of the deputies roared. Gunfire erupted, the deafening cracks echoing through the small cabin. Abigail screamed, dropping to the floor and curling her body completely over little Samuel to shield him from the flying splintered wood and stray bullets. Sheriff Boone stomped into the cabin, his gun drawn. He looked out the shattered window, watching his men chase Josiah's retreating figure into the dense, snowy pines. Boone then slowly turned his dead eyes down to Abigail, who was kneeling on the floor, clutching the crying baby. Boone cocked his revolver. "Now, Mrs. Preston, let's have a look at that child." The air in the cabin grew thick and suffocating, reeking of burned gunpowder and the harsh, metallic scent of fear. Through the shattered side window, the chilling winter wind howled back into the room, biting at Abigail's skin. But the cold outside was nothing compared to the ice in Sheriff Wyatt Boone's eyes. He stood over her, his silver star glinting in the firelight, the barrel of his heavy Colt revolver aimed directly at her chest. "I won't ask you again, Mrs. Preston," Boone said, his voice a low, gravelly threat that vibrated in the small room. "Hand over the boy. You have no part in this family business, and I have no desire to make a widow a casualty of the law." Abigail's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird, but a sudden, fierce heat flooded her veins. The terrified, grieving widow who had sat by the fire 5 days ago was dead. In her place was a mother, awakened by the desperate, clinging weight of the infant in her arms. She slowly pushed herself up from the floorboards, her grip on Samuel tightening. "You are no lawman," Abigail spat, her voice trembling but laced with absolute venom. "You're a butcher, and this child is none of your concern." Boone's lips curled into a sneer. "That man out there murdered my sister." He bashed her head in to steal her inheritance, and he took her boy to ensure he had the only claim to the Denver Railroad fortune our father left behind. "Now, I am taking my nephew back to civilization." "Josiah told me who you are," Abigail countered, taking a slow step backward toward the heavy stone hearth. "He told me Sarah bled out because she was delicate, and you wanted this baby dead so the inheritance would fall to you. I see the truth in your eyes, Boone. You don't look like a grieving brother, you look like a man counting his gold." Boone's expression darkened, the facade of the righteous sheriff dropping completely. The mask slipped, revealing the ruthless, greedy predator beneath. He cocked the hammer back on his revolver, the mechanical click sounding deafening in the tense silence. "You're a smart woman. Too smart for your own good," Boone sneered, stepping over the splintered remains of the front door. "It's a tragedy, really. The official report will say Josiah Cole broke into your home, held you hostage, and in the ensuing shootout, both you and the infant perished. A damn shame. Now, give me the blanket." "He is my child!" Abigail screamed. "A desperate, feral lie born of pure instinct. Doc Miller was wrong. My baby lived. This is my child, you monster!" Boone let out a harsh, barking laugh. "Do you take me for a fool? I know you took in Cole's brat. I can see the mountain dirt still on the blanket." He lunged forward, his heavy leather-gloved hand reaching out to snatch the bundle from her arms. But Abigail had been stepping backward for a reason. As Boone lunged, she twisted her body, shielding Samuel, and her right hand shot out to the stone hearth. Her fingers wrapped around the thick, cast-iron fireplace poker she had used to stoke the embers. With a raw scream that tore her throat, she swung the heavy iron bar with every ounce of strength her exhausted body possessed. The heavy iron connected with a sickening crack against the side of Boone's skull, just above his left ear. Boone roared in pain, his gun discharging wildly into the ceiling, raining plaster and splinters down upon them. He staggered backward, clutching his bleeding head, his hat knocked to the floor. The blow hadn't knocked him unconscious, but it had deeply dazed him. Without hesitating, Abigail bolted. She ran toward the back of the cabin, kicking open the door to the small root cellar. It wasn't a place to hide, it was a trap, but it was all she had. She practically threw herself down the narrow wooden stairs, clutching Samuel tightly to her chest to absorb the shock of her frantic descent. She reached the dirt floor of the cellar, smelling the heavy scent of potatoes and damp earth. She frantically grabbed a heavy wooden crate of winter squash and shoved it against the bottom of the cellar door, barricading herself in the darkness. She huddled in the farthest corner, burying her face in Samuel's blanket to muffle his terrified cries. Above her, the floorboards groaned beneath Boone's heavy, furious footfalls. "You're gonna burn for that, you crazy bitch," Boone bellowed, his voice distorted by rage and pain. "I'll set this whole damn cabin on fire and roast you both." Outside, the mountain had erupted into a chaotic war zone. Josiah Cole was not a man to be hunted in his own element. The moment he had vaulted through the window, he hadn't run blindly into the tree line. He had circled back. The 5 deputies had fanned out, their boots crunching loudly in the melting snow, completely unaware that they had just stepped into the domain of an apex predator. Josiah moved with the silent, lethal grace of a mountain lion. He wore white wool underneath his buffalo skins, and he used the snow-heavy branches of the blue spruces for cover. Crack! Josiah's Winchester lever-action rifle barked from the dense brush. One of Boone's deputies clutched his thigh and went down screaming, his blood painting the pristine white snow a stark, brilliant crimson. "He's in the trees! By the windfall!" another deputy shouted, wildly firing his shotgun into the woods. The buckshot shredded pine needles but hit nothing else. Josiah had already relocated. He moved swiftly through the deep drifts, his lungs burning with the icy air. His mind laser-focused on one singular, terrifying thought: Abigail and Samuel. He had to finish these men quickly, or Boone would slaughter his family, and in his heart, he realized that was exactly what they were. Abigail was no longer just a savior. She was the mother of his child, the fierce protector of his blood. He flanked the posse. He drew his heavy Colt from his hip, wielding it in his left hand while keeping the rifle in his right. He stepped out from behind a massive boulder and fired twice. 2 more deputies dropped, incapacitated by clean, non-lethal shots to their shoulders and knees. Josiah didn't want to be a murderer, despite what Boone claimed. He just wanted to break their ranks. The remaining 2 deputies, seeing 3 of their men bleeding in the snow and facing an unseen, ghost-like sniper, lost their nerve entirely. "Screw this! He's a damn demon!" one of them yelled, dropping his rifle and running toward the tethered horses. The other followed suit, scrambling onto his saddle and galloping wildly down the valley road, abandoning their corrupt sheriff to his fate. Josiah didn't waste a second watching them flee. He ejected the spent shells from his weapons, his eyes locking onto the cabin. He saw the smoke beginning to curl from the broken front window. Boone was making good on his threat. He had taken an oil lamp and smashed it against the wooden floorboards near the hearth. "Abigail!" Josiah roared, breaking from the tree line and sprinting across the clearing toward the burning cabin. Inside the cellar, Abigail choked on the thick, acrid black smoke seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. The heat above was intensifying rapidly. Boone was stomping around, kicking over furniture to feed the flames. "Come on out, Mrs. Preston," Boone taunted, coughing against the smoke. "Give me the boy and I'll pull you out of the fire. It's your last chance." Abigail held Samuel tighter. The baby was struggling to breathe, his tiny chest heaving against her. Tears streamed down her face, cutting through the soot. She looked around the pitch-black cellar. There was a small, ground-level coal chute at the back, heavily boarded up for the winter. It was her only chance. She set Samuel down in a wooden basket, whispering a frantic, tearful prayer, and grabbed a heavy rusted iron shovel from the corner. She began to batter the wooden boards covering the chute, swinging with a desperate, manic strength born of a mother's absolute refusal to let her child die. Upstairs, Boone was preparing to kick open the cellar door when the front of the cabin practically exploded inward. Josiah burst through the smoke and flames like a vengeful spirit. His buffalo coat was singed, his face streaked with sweat, soot, and blood from a grazing bullet wound on his cheek. He leveled his Colt directly at Boone's chest. "Your fight is with me, Wyatt," Josiah roared over the crackling flames. Boone spun around, his eyes widening in shock. He raised his weapon, but Josiah was faster. Bang! Josiah's bullet struck Boone's right shoulder, shattering the bone and sending his revolver clattering to the burning floorboards. Boone staggered back, clutching his arm, his face twisting in agony. "You're a dead man, Cole," Boone spat, spitting blood onto the floor. "You can't hide forever. The territory will hunt you down." "Let them try," Josiah said, his voice deadly calm. He stepped forward, grabbing Boone by the collar of his duster, and physically threw the heavy sheriff out the broken front doorway. Boone tumbled down the porch steps and landed hard in the slushy snow, groaning in defeat. Josiah didn't spare him another glance. The cabin was rapidly becoming an inferno. "Abigail!" he shouted, dropping to his knees and tearing at the cellar door. He hauled it open, coughing as a plume of black smoke rushed up into his face. "Abigail, take my hand!" Down in the darkness, Abigail had finally broken through the coal chute. Sunlight and fresh, freezing air poured in. She heard Josiah's voice ringing down the stairs. "Josiah! I'm here! We're here!" she cried out. Josiah rushed down the wooden steps, ignoring the flames that licked at the ceiling above them. He found Abigail huddled near the chute, clutching the basket holding Samuel. Without a word, he scooped both Abigail and the basket into his massive arms. With a primal surge of strength, Josiah carried them up the stairs, sprinting through the burning living room, dodging falling, flaming timbers. He burst through the back door of the cabin, stumbling out into the freezing, pristine air of the backyard. They collapsed together into a deep snowbank, gasping for breath, their lungs burning from the smoke. For a long minute, the only sounds were the roaring of the fire consuming the cabin and their ragged breathing. Josiah immediately pulled the blanket back from the basket. Samuel let out a loud, healthy, protesting wail at the sudden chill. Josiah collapsed backward into the snow, a profound, shuddering sob of relief tearing from his chest. He looked over at Abigail. Her face was covered in black soot. Her dress was torn. Her knuckles were bleeding from the shovel, but her eyes were bright, fierce, and undeniably alive. "You saved him," Josiah whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out, his trembling hand finding hers in the snow. "You saved us both, Abigail." Abigail looked back at the burning husk of her home, the cabin where she had loved her late husband, the room where she had delivered her stillborn daughter. It was all turning to ash. But as she felt the warmth of Josiah's large, calloused hand holding hers and heard the strong, demanding cry of the infant beside her, she realized she felt no grief for the building. The heavy, suffocating weight of mourning that had anchored her to this lonely mountain had burned away. "We need to go," Abigail said softly, squeezing his hand tightly. "Boone won't be the last. If Sarah's inheritance is as large as he said, there will be other men." Josiah sat up, his eyes locking onto hers. "I don't care about the money, Abigail. I swear to you. I'll sign it all away to the territory, if it means keeping him safe. I just want a life for my son." He paused, his gaze softening, the rugged mountain man looking incredibly vulnerable. "But I have no home to offer you now. My cabin is marked. Yours is gone. I have nothing but the clothes on my back and a hunted name." Abigail reached over and gently pulled Samuel from the basket, cradling him against her chest. The baby immediately quieted, turning his face toward her warmth. She looked at Josiah, a slow, beautiful smile breaking through the soot on her face. "You have a son," Abigail corrected him gently. "And you have me. We will go west. California, Oregon, it doesn't matter. We will change our names. We will build a new cabin. This frontier is vast, Josiah. It can hide a family." Josiah's breath caught in his throat. A family, the words hung in the crisp winter air, sealing a bond that had been forged in a blizzard, baptized in blood, and cemented by the most desperate kind of love. By the time the sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Rockies, painting the snowfields in hues of deep violet and gold, the homestead was nothing but smoldering embers. Sheriff Boone had dragged himself away, leaving a trail of blood, broken and defeated, his career and his murderous ambitions ruined. In the distance, a single horse, carrying 2 adults and a bundled infant, picked its way carefully down the mountain pass. They were leaving the past behind in the ashes. The mountain man who had come begging for milk had found salvation, and the grieving widow who had opened her door to a storm had found the family her heart had been bleeding for. They were strangers brought together by tragedy, bound forever by the fragile, resilient life of a child they would raise together under the vast, unending skies of the untamed West. Would you like me to refine any of these dramatic moments? Or are you ready to share this incredible story with your audience? Your support means the world to me. If this tale of frontier survival, fierce maternal love, and rugged redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button. It helps the algorithm push these historical dramas to more story lovers like you. Don't forget to share this video with your friends who love a gritty, heart-pounding Western romance. And if you want to hear more thrilling, real-life inspired stories from the wild, untamed corners of history, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Tell me in the comments below, what would you have done if a stranger knocked on your door in a blizzard? Stay wild, stay safe, and I'll see you in the next story.
Hi, my name is William Sunny, the owner and manager of Iron Cowboy Gardena. After watching the video, he came begging for milk for his child. She fed the baby herself, became the mother the child needed. I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? What stayed with me most was how a single act of compassion changed the course of several lives. Hezekiah arrived carrying grief, fear, and the responsibility of a child he desperately wanted to protect. Abigail was carrying wounds of her own, yet she still found the strength to help when someone needed her most. Watching trust slowly grow between them made this story feel especially meaningful. Do you think Abigail realized from the beginning how important she would become in that child's life? And what moment made you feel that Hezekiah was finally starting to heal from his past? I think this story gently reminds us that kindness often matters most when someone feels lost or overwhelmed. Sometimes the smallest decision to help another person can create a future none of us could have predicted. If this story meant something to you, feel free to leave a comment, like, or subscribe. I always enjoy reading your thoughts and hearing Which part of the story stayed with you the longest?